This next session is Canadian multilateralism versus, maybe versus is the important word there, American unilateralism. We have two well-known speakers, Peggy Mason, who's president of the Rideau Institute and vice chair of Canadian Pugwash Group, former diplomat in Disarmament as well, and David Carment, who's a professor at Carleton University, my alma mater, at the School of International, Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. He's a past editor of Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. So we will start with Peggy on this, and then to David.
Yes. International cooperation is fundamental for every single nation. Unilateralism has obvious limits, even for the most powerful, and whether or not they perceive those limits. Global problems beyond the ability of any one state or group of states to solve, global problems are beyond the ability of any one state or group of states to solve, and of course we've heard the list: climate change, the destruction of nature through the loss of biodiversity, the massive augmentation of nuclear weapons, and unregulated AI tend to be named as the sort of key existential threats. The fact that the rules on which vital international cooperation is based are imperfectly implemented at the best of times and now under direct threat from Trump 2.0 is not a reason to ditch them, but instead for countries like Canada to work ever harder to promote their fair application and to revise, update, and reform them in what is of necessity an ongoing incremental process of building that shared international law, the shared foundation for multilateralism and international cooperation at the global level to take place. I should have said my focus is going to be multilateralism, international cooperation, and the United Nations. And in particular, I know the last panel is going to look at things Canada can do. I hope to throw a few ideas their way in terms of what Canada can do with respect to helping the UN in its hour of perhaps greatest need. So the challenge up until Trump 2.0 has been, this incremental process of trying to elaborate the international rules of the road and strengthen the UN with fits and starts and lots of problems. But right now with Trump 2.0 and the power he wields so unpredictably, unreasonably, mindlessly, we have an even more fundamental challenge. We have to hold our ground on the fundamentals, and nowhere is this more necessary and more difficult than with respect to the cornerstone of our international rules-based order, the United Nations. Many of you may be aware of the funding, the massive funding cuts that the UN is facing. I mean, they didn't have a surfeit of money prior to the United States cutting the U.S., the UN's largest single donor, cutting or freezing huge blocks of funding, not only for the UN Secretariat, but for the many, a multitude of agencies that work, UN agencies, hitting humanitarian operations particularly hard, but not only. And that has left, they have also left, the United States has left a raft of multilateral agreements, pursued unilateral peace initiatives, and has appeared to dismiss key tenets of the UN Charter, such as respect for the territorial integrity of states, and has taken the breach of the non-use of force obligation under the UN Charter to new lows with military attacks on drug-carrying small boats in international waters, and in joining with Israel in its illegal attack, bombing of Iran. In the words of the International Crisis Group, leading international think tank that tracks international conflict, and particularly UN approaches to them, this leaves the wider UN membership facing tough choices about how to manage Trump's decisions, both for the UN as an institution and for the various crises where the UN is engaged. And in many cases, the task for Canada and other UN members will be, and I'm quoting, vital damage control. Member states like Canada who care about the UN, we say how much we care about it. We've demonstrated that. I mean, the new government has in its high-level activity around the UN. But more than that is needed. We will need to offer strong political, diplomatic, and financial support to the UN. So what I want to do now very briefly is I just want to look at three, I guess, of the key UN challenges that it's facing because of Trump, directly because of Trump 2.0, and how Canada can and should help. The first is safeguarding UN humanitarian assistance to Gaza. It's still, Rafah crossing is still not open. It's still, full aid is still not up and running. The UN organization is the only organization with the capacity and experience to deliver aid at adequate scale in Gaza, and UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, is fundamental to the UN's aid efforts in this regard. As many may be aware, Israel has been systematically trying to, well, essentially dismantle UNRWA, but to force it out completely out of Gaza. The new, and this is very recent, binding, in this case it's an International Court of Justice judgment. It came from an advisory opinion, but it's pursuant to an international treaty on the protection of UN personnel, and under that treaty, the advisory, any disputes among members are to be solved by an advisory opinion which is binding on the parties. And so this recent decision has found, focusing on Israel's aid obligations as both an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also as a UN member. And the court specifically found that Israel had not substantiated its Hamas-affiliated allegations against UNRWA. That's their whole argument. They're infested with Hamas, and therefore we have the right to prevent them from operating. So the court has rejected that argument, no evidence, insufficient evidence, and it has ruled that Israel has the legal duty, this is a legal obligation, binding legal obligation, not just to refrain from impeding UNRWA, but to cooperate with it in good faith. It was a ringing denunciation by the court of Israel's failure to live up to these obligations. Again, I emphasize, not only as an occupying power, but with respect to its obligations to the UN as a member of the UN. Now, Canada has joined, I think the statement was in July of 2005, has joined in a statement with other donors, a large raft of humanitarian donors, on the importance of UN operations, UN aid operations in Gaza not being impeded. But they did not specifically name UNRWA. And now, with this court ruling, there is absolutely no justification for not specifically joining Canada, for joining countries like Norway and Ireland, actively calling underlining the essential role of UNRWA and calling for its unimpeded access. But there's more than that Canada can do, because you know, there's an effort now to try and reform. I mean, UNRWA has a really broad mandate, not just aid delivery, but education and many aspects. It's fundamental to you know, the Palestinian refugees. And so one of the very good recommendations that has been made through a UN study is that UN members support UNRWA by creating an executive board, and of course that would be in particular, but not only, significant donors, comprising UN members that would have responsibility for providing the agency with political backing, administrative oversight, and funding assistance. And that would really insulate it from these kinds of attacks that it faces. And that I would really hope that Canada would consider, put itself forward as being a member of that board. How much time have I got? 12 minutes, okay. Okay, second area, a second challenge. And this one, it's hard. I mean, I was a external faculty member of the Pearson Peacekeeping Center from 1995 until the end of 2012. And so have done a lot of peacekeeping training on the UN role and stabilization operations. And Walter Dorn, who was the speaker on the first panel, I was very proud as the Rideau Institute, we published a report of his on the need for Canada to really up its game on training, peacekeeping training by reopening the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, which, you know, was allowed to lapse shamefully. Now, so the next challenge that I'm going to touch on is Haiti. And nowhere is the danger of the Trump presidency, the danger it poses to core UN peace and security activities, more clear than regarding Haiti and the latest US-driven UN Security Council resolution thereon. Some of you might remember that in Trump's first term, he forced through budgetary threats a premature closing of the UN police mission in Haiti. And boy, that really helped the situation out, didn't it? There was the next stage was a military support mission to the Haitian police, which was under the control of, was led by the Kenyans. And they had very little success against the gangs, and the reason was acknowledged by all, that it was way too small, it was underfunded, it was not equipped to confront the scale and sophistication of the gangs controlling large parts of Haiti. So, and the US had been behind this previous mission. So, Trump administration wants a new mission. When they first presented their resolution to the Security Council, it was so absurd that, I mean, Russia and China with merit said, this will never work. This is crazy. Anyway, in the end, they said, go ahead. They abstained. So on October 1st, this resolution was passed, and instead, a new force has been authorized. It is called a gang suppression force. So it's a UN-authorized gang suppression force with up to 5,500 personnel. The leadership of the new UN-authorized but not UN-led gang suppression force is not going to be a force commander. It's going to be a standing group of partners providing overall strategic direction, but each force leading under its own national flag. I don't know what military would go into a joint operation with no joint commander. But anyway, that's what I mean. When the Russians first saw it and the Chinese, they just said, well, I'm sure not just them, but they were, because they're veto carrying, their views were highlighted. So, but that's not. Now, in addition, not part of the mission, separated, authorization for a UN support office in Haiti to provide much, much needed logistical and operational support to the GCF, the gang suppression force. So that was authorized by the UN Security Council as well. Okay, here's the best part of all. All of it is voluntary funding. All of it. So how do you think this is going to go? Now, for reasons that, you know, well, maybe it's because it's part of our whole thing about having to spend all this money, you know, under the defense portfolio. Canada actually has pledged. Canada has pledged what has been described. That I couldn't get the figures. Significant funding to this. I mean, but a heck of a lot more funding is going to be needed. And in fact, frankly, funding is not going to help if there's no proper command structure. So final point, final challenge, because I'm running my time out. The final challenge is, and I mean, talk about the horror of the timing. A new UN Secretary General has to be appointed by the end of 2026. Now, the way it works, the UN Security Council, there have to be at least 9 positive votes, so a majority of votes and no vetoes. So in other words, they choose. The UN Security Council chooses the candidate, and then that candidate goes to the General Assembly for appointing through a majority vote. The General Assembly, therefore, have no way of, they can't, I mean, they can propose candidates to the Security Council, but they can't propose and vote on candidates of their, you know, themselves. All they can do is, if the candidate is really bad, by a majority vote of 51%, they can reject the candidate. I mean, it may well come, frankly, to that, or it might be stopped at the UN Security Council by there not being 9 positive votes, as happened to the U.S. when they were trying to get authorization for their invasion, their second UN resolution to invade Iraq, and they didn't get it because they couldn't get the 9 positive votes. But anyway, all of which to say, you can see the danger. You can see the danger if Trump gets his person, you know, into that seat, and then proceeds with what he has already signaled as returning the UN to its core peace and security functions, you know, as if development assistance, you know, wasn't relevant to preventing conflict. So that's what we're going to be faced with at the end of 2026, and that means that countries have really, like Canada and others, have really got to start working hard at seeing if they can possibly identify someone that might, you know, be able to stick-handle their way through in order to, you know, that we don't end up in a situation where we have, you know, someone who wants to dismantle the UN at the head of the UN. So lots and lots and lots for states that say they care about the UN to do, and not least Canada. Thank you.
Our next speaker is David Carment.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. A real honor to be on this panel. So, having heard mention of the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, something I haven't heard of in a long time, it reminds me of the other institutes that were around at the same time. And when we think of the 1960s, it's often described as the golden age of Canadian diplomacy under Pearson. But I think if we 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll reflect back and think that perhaps there was a second golden age under Jean Chrétien, or at least the end of the Mulroney era. And, you know, there was the North-South Institute, for example. We have Roy Culpepper here, who was the director for many years. We have CIPS, not the CIPS that you know, but the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security, which was established by the Liberal government. Well respected for its time. Bernard Wood was the director there for a while. And, of course, we had Rights and Democracy, another organization that fell by the wayside. And I say this because this is a nice segue into my point about the need perhaps to reinvigorate multilateralism, but not so much at the level of federal or formal government-to-government relations, but rather people like yourself engaging around the world. And when I look at this audience today, I say desperate need for young people to be part of Pugwash or whatever organization they so choose, and they need to engage sooner rather than later, precisely because there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, and I don't see our generation doing a very good job of solving these problems. So let's go back 31 years when I was younger, starting my career as an academic. This was the time of the Rwanda genocide, as well as Srebrenica, global tragedies that are being repeated as we speak. Today we hear the word genocide used frequently to describe what is happening in Gaza. No less than 4, possibly 5 expert reports have confirmed it as such, even if our leaders are reluctant to describe it that way. But in 1994, confronting genocide, forced displacement, and ethnic cleansing generated a much different response from many states. Now, this is how we relate it back to U.S. unilateralism. On the one hand, the U.S. confirmed its status as a post-Cold War hegemonic power, acting unilaterally to block successive UN Security Council efforts to deploy a preventive peacekeeping force into Rwanda, eventually convincing Canada, cajoling some might say, to take an after-the-fact action in an ill-fated effort to protect those refugees who fled across the border into what was then called Zaire. This was often described as the bungle and jungle. You won't read about it in history books, students, because the Liberals don't want you to know about how that catastrophe generated a whole bunch of decisions that they were reluctant to take, including how to engage in complex conflicts, how to protect civil society organizations working in war zones, the development of an independent early warning and intelligence capacity. But what indeed did flow onward was a range of international efforts to advance strategies of proactive engagement, including the responsibilities agendas, small arms surveys, conflict prevention, early warning, NGO capacity building, and even preventive deployment, in which Canada could realistically be called or be described as a leader. Diplomacy was front and center. Maybe I am looking at that era through rose-colored glasses, but I think we were far more engaged than we are now. A lot of that has to do with what happened with successive prime ministers. Bridges were built, increasing Canada's presence in developing and war-torn nations around the world. Civil society organizations within Canada and abroad were strengthened. Efforts to support weak and failing states took many forms, sometimes with uneven results. Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan, for example, coming to a head during 9/11 with U.S. unilateral intervention driving the agenda, followed by disastrous interventions in Libya and Syria. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University, over 940,000 people were killed by direct post-9/11 war violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan between 2001 and 2023. Of these, more than 432,000 were civilians. An estimated 3.6 to 3.8 million people have died indirectly as a result of U.S. interventions. In a nutshell, U.S. unilateralism, so it seems, is unchanging, as is evident in its unwavering support for Israel, no matter the costs. On the other hand, the world changed, and along with it, so too did Canada, incrementally perhaps, irreversibly, perhaps as well, first under Stephen Harper and then Justin Trudeau and now Mark Carney. Canada would eventually abandon the responsibilities agendas and all those efforts that underpin them, including an independent capacity for early warning and conflict prevention, mediation, and support for CSOs. Canada's backing for the ICC, International Criminal Court, would be selective, typically targeting adversaries of the U.S. When the U.S. threatened to sanction the ICC for its investigation into U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, Canada's response was ambivalent. Under Justin Trudeau and his foreign ministers, Canada did not play any significant role in the United Nations. Not only did the government fail to provide guidance on how Canada could recast its place in the world when it was most desperately needed, this is Trump 1.0, Canada failed to secure free trade agreements with both China and India, while also losing a seat on the UN Security Council. Now, there was a concerted effort on the part of NGOs to prevent Canada from getting that seat on the Security Council. Greta Thunberg, who you all know because she was recently in Israel, detained there, was one of those proponents advancing an agenda that would prevent Canada from securing a seat on the Security Council. Which is sad because it speaks to our lack of presence around the world and the failure to grasp the fundamental realities that how we are perceived in the world is much different than the way we were perceived in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Today, Canada's foreign policy positions and policies have become mirror images of U.S. interests, whether these pertain to regime challenges in Venezuela, Myanmar, Syria, and Iran, confronting geopolitical rivals Russia and China, or more recently implementing a common Asia-Pacific strategy. There are, of course, some exceptions, such as Canada's longstanding opposition to the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Efforts to rebuild relations with India and China after 15 years of counterproductive policies show promise. However, the long-standing absence of independent diplomatic engagement means limited capacity to participate at a time when America has withdrawn from or is scaling back its contributions to key organizations and global compacts, such as the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, the United Nations, and the World Trade Organization. Today, Canada's foreign policy establishment finds itself desperately playing catch-up to an ambitious Trump agenda, coming to terms with the fact that its southern neighbor, which Chrystia Freeland once described as the indispensable nation, is now in a position to inflict significant harm on the Canadian economy. After the Cold War, a key motivating factor for all of Canada's foreign policy choices was the assumption that strong economic ties promoted peace. Today, economic warfare, often without formal war declarations, plays a central role in global power dynamics, shifting focus from military action to economic leverage. Canada's strategic blind spot was failing to recognize America's shift towards economic coercion and self-sufficiency. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor to former U.S. President Joe Biden, described the U.S. shift as a status focus on reshoring critical industries. Trump is not the one who originated economic coercion. It's been a long-standing issue. Yeah. Trump, in contrast, targets alliances, foreign aid, and trade deals that he says disadvantage the U.S. In reality, the U.S. has long used the rationale of national emergencies, more than 40 are currently active, to justify imposing costs on adversaries and allies. This strategy has boosted America's share of G7 GDP to more than 50%, closer to 55% and growing, reinforcing its dominance amongst key trading partners. This shift drives foreign investment toward the U.S. to the detriment of other G7 nations, including Canada. The rise in U.S. economic dominance within the G7 contrasts with the G7's overall decline relative to the BRICS. I assume you know what the BRICS are. Yeah. Over the past 2 decades, the BRICS economies have grown to match G7 economies in global GDP share. So think about that. Our relative position vis-a-vis the U.S. is diminishing on the one hand, but we're also losing position relative to the countries that are emerging economies. At the same time, as I noted, Canada's GDP per capita has declined relative to the U.S. Regional supply chains tied to America have increased dependency but failed to address Canada's weak manufacturing base and low productivity. Despite promises to leverage immigration for growth, Canada struggles to retain skilled STEM graduates, marking a failure of economic policy. Yet, and get this, in the aftermath of COVID, a decision was taken by the Liberal government, led by Chrystia Freeland, to more closely align the Canadian economy with the U.S. through friendshoring, while at the same time committing Canada to reducing supply chains in support of delinking from China in favor of building Fortress North America. All my colleagues at NIPSIA were celebrating delinking is the way to go. We're going to work with the U.S. Blindsided. In short, Canada failed to heed the warning signs of drawing closer to the U.S. without adapting to multipolar complexities. Ottawa continues to lean on shared neoliberal values, and Jake Sullivan himself said neoliberalism is dead. It's not the basis for any kind of consensus, global consensus going forward, such as those that drive the coalition of the willing. A coalition of the willing is simply an organization of states that are incapable of finding an entity such as NATO or possibly the UN to work through, so they have to create an artificial one that confronts Russia. So how does Canada adapt to these changing geopolitical circumstances? First, and I'll lay this out, our leaders must recognize that their policy choices risk becoming incoherent in a divided strategic landscape, where economic coercion and geopolitical realignments require confident, autonomous decision-making rather than reactive compliance with U.S. priorities. Instead of seeking retribution through a tariff war, Canada's leaders must initiate a strategic reset. For example, an obsession, a reliance on military spending objectives such as meeting NATO's 2 or is it 5% of GDP target is a diversion from the deeper structural challenges Canada faces in traversing an increasingly divided global order. Second, Canada's growing dependence on the U.S. has blurred the lines between its own defense and security policies and those of its southern neighbor. For example, the recently released political interference report showed a Canada that remains aligned with American interests, particularly regarding China and Russia, but also India and Iran. How quickly that report was dismissed and how quickly we have shifted to re-engaging with India and China, recognizing the desperation in our act and also the need to re-engage countries that we have essentially said we can no longer trust. The report supports an agenda that ensures Canada cleaves closely to America's security and defense interests through the pretense, and I say this in all honesty, the pretense that America's problems with China and Russia are also our problems. I talk to students in my school, and they cannot differentiate between U.S. and Canadian foreign policy interests. That's indoctrination. In practical terms, policies that seek the total defeat of enemies typically not only demand the decisive and proactive use of military force to attain specific objectives to undermine the adversary, they also require escalation dominance. What I'm pointing to here is the suggestion that America wants to and will go to war with China. This is not Canada's fight. This is America's fight for preeminence. That requires escalation dominance, prioritizing military preparedness, force modernization, and operational planning to ensure the capability to secure victory in conflict scenarios and the ability to escalate readily. But they come at a much higher risk of regional and global war, especially when involving nuclear powers. You know, there's been 3,000 incidences of breakdown in deterrence between Russia and the U.S. over the course of since 2014. The deterrence mechanism that underpinned the post-Cold War era between Russia and the West has been dismantled, and we are partly responsible for undermining that deterrence between Russia and ourselves. While diplomacy may still play a role in these strategies, it often excludes engagement with the actual adversary. People were talking in the last panel about engaging Russia, as if this is some kind of novel suggestion. Or controversial. I mean, you really can't do diplomacy if you're not engaging those with whom you don't agree. And focus instead on shaping international coalitions of the willing, and garnering support from allies. Not only does exclusion reflect a zero-sum framing and a pack mentality that rewards ideology and Manichaean thinking, it is also inherently risky and destabilizing, because you won't know what they want unless you talk to them. Surprise, surprise. We can't trust those Russians. What they say publicly is not the same as what they think privately. Well, then you need to engage them in frank discussion off the record. Furthermore, exclusion may not even be feasible and practical in today's highly geopolitical interest-based and multipolar landscape. On the other hand, military restraint emphasizes the complementary power of strength and peace, seeking to harmonize rather than oppose these forces. Central to this shift is the process of weaning the U.S. and its allies off institutions deeply rooted in unrestrained and poorly executed interventions. This transformation requires fundamental changes in the mandates and purposes of core foreign policy bureaucracies, including diplomatic, foreign aid, intelligence, and defense departments. Now, I heard a lot of people, criticizing the decision to shut down U.S. aid. But if you look at its track record, it's been very interventionist, and it's been very focused on supporting political change in states where we don't always have it present otherwise. And don't kid yourself, Canada's also been part of that game as well. So you want to change, you got to look at all the foreign policy instruments, including foreign aid, intelligence, and defense departments that have repeatedly demonstrated ineffectiveness in foreign interventions and warfighting over the past 2 decades. Flexibility means engaging selectively in U.S.-led initiatives rather than committing to them unconditionally. Fundamental to this strategy is realization, as unpalatable as it might be, that Canada must not only navigate a world in which it is subservient to U.S. interests, the hierarchy that dominates our foreign policy agenda, it must also find a way to offset potential harmful U.S. policies that are implemented to advance American interests against our own. That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
But why is this problematic? Because, simply put, Canada's strategic environment is becoming increasingly bifurcated. Overcoming that incoherence is a major challenge. For example, Canada's defense and security policies on China are hardline. They have not wavered one bit in following what the Americans are advising on how to confront China. And yet we expect to engage with China in a trade dialogue or trade negotiations, but while at the same time suggesting they're our number one security threat. I'm trying to reconcile those two objectives in a foreign policy agenda that has any strategic orientation. This is a reality born from, Canada's defense and security policies on China hardline. This is a reality born from a highly integrated U.S.-Canada security architecture that emerged strongly from 9/11 onward. In my opinion, few of the defense and security elites in Canada and those bureaucracies they represent are giving balanced advice on how to engage China, preferring delinking and containment instead. That's not our game. It can't be our game. If Carney wants to meet, 50% growth in other non-U.S. trade partners in 10 years? Double, 100%? This is a strategy that won't get us there. Because China doesn't have time for a country that's going to cause trouble for it. There are plenty of other trading countries that will work with China. So we need not just narrowly constructed advice, we need advice issued to advance public debate. Mark Carney's and Anita Anand's China Reset is a welcome start to that debate. And I have some other comments that I'll get to later on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we go to questions, to see if there's any back and forth here between Peggy. Did you have any comments? No?
Nope, I'm happy to take questions.
Please arrive. I was going to ask a question on subservience to U.S. policy and Canada's economic dependence. Are there sometimes strategic measures taken, hoping that with economic strengthening, political independence can then result, but it'll take a few years? Are we seeing some of that?
Well, I think that was the underlying premise for increased cooperation and integration with the U.S. and Canada. In fact, that may be a reality that's yet to be borne out. I can't predict the future, but what I can predict is that our predictions about what lies ahead are deeply flawed. The assumption that Russia is a hegemonic power that will use whatever capabilities to attack or seize. I can't reconcile why someone would say, on the one hand, there's too much of the Arctic that Russia would never want, and yet at the same time, unprovoked, it would target us with hypersonic missiles. Yeah. So there's some dysfunctional assumptions in our foreign policy that are not driven by overarching strategy. So for Canada to integrate closely with the U.S. means accepting a lot of their mindset, which is threat-based and adversarial-based. And I think we have to, I would implore the students in this room to get away from threat-based thinking and adversarial-driven strategic thinking and focus on problems. Because problems ultimately necessitate collective decision-making and shared ideas and often require resources that are beyond the capacity of any single state to deliver. Problems from hell, like climate change, or rebuilding states that seem immune to rebuilding. And I'm not even suggesting that's something Canada can lead on. But my concern is that we are allowing ourselves to have everything that we hold dear to be securitized by the Americans. Our resources, our values, everything from water to critical minerals is deemed a security a threat or potential source of a security threat to the U.S. So we have to begin driving the agenda. We have to start rebuilding our credibility, which means diplomatic capacity, more people like yourselves on the ground, recognizing that the way the world sees us is not quite how we see ourselves. I think we have this sort of positive view of ourselves as perhaps the helpful fixer. I don't know if that still holds, but I'm not sure that the world sees us in those terms, especially given our position on Gaza. We also, frankly, controversially, I think we need to hold those accountable who took us or brought us here in the first place. How quickly did Mark Carney manage to shift the agenda from, it wasn't the liberals who were responsible for integrating the U.S. to Trump as the threat? And we have to work together, elbows up, to face that common enemy. Well, sometimes that our desire to work more closely with the U.S. is driven by those who are within Canada, and those individuals, whether they're policymakers or the media, should be held to account for the decisions that they made that brought us closer to a situation where we find ourselves being heavily securitized. That includes members within the defense and security community. We also have to look closely at our educational system, which is not situating our students in a way that they are prepared to engage and take Canada in an independent trajectory. Anyway, I mean, I could go on, but there's a lot more on this agenda than simply saying Trump is the problem, and he'll, once he goes, if he ever does go, we're going to be safe.
Yep, go ahead.
I'll just add one quick point, and that is, of course, one of the commitments that was made during the election campaign was for a national security review, which we basically have never had, which would, I mean, ideally you would have a full foreign policy review and a national security review, but in any event, the national security review is difficult. I mean, the campaign promise is made, but then when the implications are looked at, and of course the points you're making, then, isn't it a surprise that we haven't heard that much about a national security review? But we need one, and we need a clear, delineated national security policy. And I think the reason why there's been so much reluctance in the past is exactly because it would just demonstrate this problem of us being driven, our approach being a derivative of the American approach. And I do agree. I mean, Trump has crystallized. These problems have been building for a long, long time, and we haven't talked about, the neoliberal economic agenda, which has, soured so much of the world on globalization because of the gross inequalities it has led to, economic inequalities within and between nations, and that's led, of course, that's been a great contributor to the rise of right-wing populism and right-wing organizations. So,
Okay, let's go to the...
yeah, and I just wanted to echo about military restraint. There are those in the U.S. that are trying to build a more progressive foreign policy and defense policy focus on military restraint, and I think that's a nice place to start on a national security independence and military restraint for Canada in a national security policy.
Okay, before I go to the questions, the other questions, we have a time restraint here. How much further can I go than 12:45? Okay, great. Are you asking a question, or are you holding the mic? Okay. Furtis?
Okay. I just wanted to say, while I agree with a lot of what you said, I was a bit surprised by what you said about USAID. I have worked with USAID for a couple of decades, starting with the HIV/AIDS crisis in about the early 2000s, and then on Ebola in West Africa. And I've never thought that USAID had any kind of agenda other than saving lives, literally. In the case of HIV/AIDS, as an example, George Bush started a program called PEPFAR, that's the acronym of it, and it's widely credited with saving lives. And now that it has been dismantled, I think, there's been some back and forth between the White House and the U.S. Senate on PEPFAR, and we're not sure where it's going to go later. But for the moment, it's stopped. And a Canadian, Stephanie Nolan, who is the head of health reporting for the New York Times, has been writing article after article, most recently, I think, on Botswana and Somalia, on the impact of canceling PEPFAR on Africa. So I can tell you categorically for my own perspective over 20 years is that I never sensed any political agenda with USAID. I just saw them on the ground in Africa trying to save lives and nothing more than that.
Well, I don't disagree. I mean, when you look at the envelope and delivery of foreign aid, there's many ways in which it can be delivered. Your capacity building and infrastructure focused and health focused delivery of aid, without question, is important. But I'm talking about the political agendas that were served through USAID. Having worked in conflict zones for the first 20 years of my career, I go into these places and I encounter civil society organizations who are, whether it's in West Africa or the Balkans or even Crimea, where I spent some time on behalf of the Canadian government working with, trying to reconcile different perspectives. It didn't work, but Canada was trying to strengthen the Tatar ethno-Russian nationalist diplomacy. We engaged in that. My point is that these are places where typically you had non-U.S. foreign aid agencies working because they were respected and seen as far more neutral. What I'm suggesting here is that there was a political agenda, much of what USAID delivered, and a good measurement of that would be the number of small NGOs in Ukraine, for example, that dried up after USAID cut its funding there, because these were underpinned by American money, also in Moldova, primarily in West Central, East Europe. Yes, USAID did some good things, but it also did some pernicious things. I'd be happy to talk to you about the example in which they supported an effort to destabilize Cuba through a social media campaign, but they denied complete responsibility for it. So political destabilization or reorientation was part of the USAID agenda.
Walter?
Thanks for your excellent talks. Peggy, I want to run an idea by you that the General Assembly could refuse to take one candidate for Secretary General. They could say they will veto, because they have a veto, if there aren't a choice from the Security Council. So send one, we will send it back to Security Council. Send two or three, then that gives the world a real choice.
Well, it's a very interesting idea. It is, because it amplifies the capacity of the General Assembly to influence what's going on. Of course, they have to get their act together, and countries like Canada can play a role there, because 51%, it takes, they only need a majority vote to get the U.S. only needs a majority vote in the General Assembly to get its person through. But if there can be, but you've identified a way where there could be a real reason for looking hard at good candidates, more than one candidate. So thank you very much for that. And since you've reminded me, in terms of the things that Canada should do, if we want to start taking a more independent role again, and we want to get back up to scratch, I mean, UN peacekeeping is going to have a hard time under the Trump administration, but it's more important than ever, and they need well-equipped, well-resourced, well-trained forces, and those forces have to have a real understanding of the political mission, the overarching peace operation that they're part of, and that requires specialized training. And that would certainly be a very good place for Department of National Defense to spend some of its money to reopen, or they can give it a new name, the International Peacekeeping Training Center. But beyond that, you know, independent Canadian foreign policy requires independent expert thinking, and you have to nourish that. And that's what CIPS did, you know, the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security. In a very short time, it became globally respected. And I mean, the Trudeau administration sort of flirted, they threw out a couple ideas vaguely in terms of having a new center. I mean, we're the only major democracy, G7 and well beyond OECD, that does not have a government-funded but arm's length international peace and security think tank.
Well, the U.S. doesn't have one anymore. They shut it down.
Oh, yes, of course. Okay, they don't too. Yes, well, let's try not to be in that camp and get out of that camp fast. Thank you.
Yusuf.
Next question.
Hi, I'm a student here at the GS PIA, and so I wanted to kind of make myself the speaker for all the students. As you said, you asked that students who are looking to become members of our, security and international relations apparatus, that we should approach international relations in terms of solving problems and not looking at threats and so on and so forth. And so with that being said, over the course of our academic careers, our very short academic careers so far, from when we became university students to now, we've seen wars and conflicts multiplying. We've seen, the entire system that we grew up in kind of fall apart around us. And that takes me to a point that was made by one of our professors who told us, well, we're trying to teach you about international relations, but the international relations system in which we evolved as students and professionals is falling apart. And the one you're going to be entering isn't going to exist. It's going to be essentially, in many principles and elements, gone. So with that being said, how do you think we as potential decision makers should approach trying to provide solutions to problems in a world that, in our sense, is becoming very dangerous and unpredictable? And a specific element is in terms of military independence and funding, as if we want to take Canada in a different direction than the US, that does mean, in some sense, for us having the ability to carry our own weight in national defense. And so how can we reconcile that with the reality that ultimately taking a different direction from the US means that we have to be able to assert our own independence and strength on the world stage?
This is for both of us? Okay. So look, I'm at the end of my career, so I can say anything I want. But you're in a risky situation where careerism may dominate your choices as an academic and as a potential employee of the Canadian government in one of these buildings right there, perhaps. You'll end up finding that it's very enticing to not question authority or not engage in raising your voice when it's most needed. But that's exactly what we need. We need to reward and support those who blow the whistle, those who question authority, and the people who hire them, because there are, we often find, I know this is easy for me to say, but universities should not be indoctrinating students ideologically. They should be opening their eyes to the ways in which you can examine problems from a diversity of perspectives. It may make you unpopular, ask me, I know, but it will also create opportunities for you to shape things in ways that those who hire you or who are your bosses may not have considered. So speaking truth to power, Canadian bureaucracy as a rule does not have that capacity, does not reward speaking truth to power, but civil servants need it. There's an ongoing lawsuit citing systemic racism in global affairs. And this speaks, frankly, to the underlying problem that had had there been an effort to actually address this at an earlier stage through structural conversation or managed conversation or engagement, it wouldn't have peaked out at a lawsuit, which is now underway. I'm reminded of a security or intelligence officer, Huda McBeal, who recently wrote a book about her experiences as being so poorly treated in CISIS that she had to quit. But the value in what she had to say was simply that she looked at the world in a slightly different way because of her experiences as a woman, as a Muslim, and as black. And that brought value to her understanding of how Canada could engage some of the countries where typically we only saw threats, and each individual was seen only as a terrorist or a threat. But she could reframe that and help us understand how Canada can engage. Finally, I would suggest that, you got to get to the numbers and question the way in which these things are pitched by the government. We've distributed about $20 billion to Ukraine over the last few years. That's a significant chunk of change, but at the cost of diminishing our aid disbursements to other countries that are equally or more important. Sudan, the forgotten crisis. No one talks about Sudan. It's arguably the largest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. So there's, I often make the point that there are costs to the kinds of choices that policies make. They often are not aware of those costs, and they need to be made aware of those costs. That's what strategic thinking is all about. I don't know if that helps.
Just before you say, another option, of course, is that you don't work for the government, you work for civil society organizations.
Yeah.
The pay's not as good, but we do a lot of good work.
I just have a very quick point to add, and that is about the statement that the system's falling apart. I mean, that, there's a lot to that in the Canadian context, you can argue. But I get very frustrated when people say, the international system, like, it's falling, international law, what does it mean? No one, the system is there. The enforcement aspect of it is the hardest nut to crack. In the UN Security Council, the hardest nut to crack will be making a dent and reducing the power of the Permanent Five in the UN Security Council. But we've seen, very innovative work by the General Assembly in response to that. But it's really, really important to remember that, the international law is actually, it has had a lot to say about, not least the Gaza conflict. And it has had an impact, and it has taken combined action of civil society and those in government that wanted to move Canada's position forward, but it has. And of course, Canada was one of the ones recently at the UN to recognize the Palestinian state. So the framework, the international framework is there. It is really being tested now, but it's all the more important that we support it, that we don't say, oh, it's all destroyed, that we articulate the importance of it and support it. Thank you.
Michael?
David answered the question I was going to ask, but this enables me to build on it and observe that that bureaucracies that engage in groupthink or cautious path dependency have a great deal of trouble adjusting to sudden changes in the international environment. And so I see this current federal government bureaucracy having trouble adjusting to developments that should require sharp changes in Canadian foreign policy. So Operation Carib, our partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard in anti-drug interdiction in the Caribbean Sea, becomes highly problematic if the U.S. military is engaging in extrajudicial killing. Is anyone asking whether we should pull out of Operation Carib? Is anyone in the bureaucracy asking whether we can still consider the United States a safe third country for the purposes of international refugee law when they are deporting people to conflict zones in countries that they have no attachment to, right? And then we could, if we want to talk about, is anyone questioning whether we should be buying very expensive defense systems like the F-35 or Aegis class radar systems, given that this will lock us into a dependence on American computing systems for decades to come. I don't see these questions being asked in official Ottawa. Am I right about that?
Well, I'll remind you, in 2011, 2012, you contributed one article of a special issue that I had the pleasure of editing on the F-35. And there, coming full circle, was the suggestion that perhaps this was an unnecessary purchase, superfluous, and so on. And I think you published a version of that through Rideau. And it met with some consternation from the Conservatives. They basically, I think the journal was waived in Parliament by the then Defense Minister, saying this is a sacrilege, it's it's defaming our soldiers and so on. And by suggesting perhaps that, we weren't being as good citizens as we should have been, by suggesting that Canada's leaders didn't have what is best in mind for Canada. So my suggestion would be that we need a bunch of stronger and better media will hold the government's feet to the fire. But there was a time, and a lot of my thinking is reminiscing about the good times, and maybe they weren't so good, but the good times were about shared, not the stovepiping that we have now, the coveted sort of approach to decision-making, D&D coming up with its answers, CSIS taking its solutions, and Foreign Affairs and others also coming up with their solutions. But really, the dialogue and the debate that had to take place was at one time, I think, much more vibrant, and more importantly, it included civil society. And I think there's a great fear within the government that opening up that can of worms, bringing ordinary folk into the discussion, would create a kind of set of foreign policy choices that would compromise the bureaucratic sort of inertia, as you describe it, which is ultimately, the funding driven. So how do we take on an organization? Remember CETA, Canada's International Development Agency? Well, they just decided unilaterally to fold it into Global Affairs Canada. So we know these decisions can be taken. And we know that, a guy like Donald Trump can unilaterally decide to shut down a good chunk of the foreign aid agencies. So what possible solutions are there for Canada to arrive at similar kinds of outcomes? One thing I do fear is that we emulate, and we are in the position right now of emulating the Trump administration, which is downsizing a lot of our foreign policy presence. And we'll still continue to talk up our diplomatic capacity without actually, rhetorically, but not actually delivering, and letting other countries do the heavy lifting for us. Do we engage Russia? No. Do we engage Iran? No. And yet these are countries that we rally behind the United States in their efforts to, go to war with. So at China, well, we'll see it. The jury's still out. So maybe we need to revisit this idea of working together and finding a mechanism for public democratic review, a more citizen-based foreign policy approach. Tall order, but possible.
Last comment briefly from Peggy.
Yes, I just want to remind that, in fact, the F-35 debate has been a very live debate. The Justin Trudeau government campaign, one of their campaign promises was getting rid of F-35s. Of course, we like to take some credit, the Rideau Institute, for the reports authored by Michael Byers that we did on the F-35. But then the weight, gets back to David Carment's point, then the weight of the defense and security establishment and the defense lobby came down on the government. And they made all these arguments about how the procurement process wouldn't allow this to happen. It had gone too far. You can't do it. And they succeeded. I mean, the Trudeau government did not want to do this. Same thing, hopefully, will not happen with Carney. But he announced during the election campaign, we got to look at that. It gave the example of dependency. And now it's under review, but everything's gone quiet. Everything's gone quiet, and we know what's happening. The same thing is happening again. So we've got to, and we and many are already doing this, trying to make as much noise on the other side as we possibly can, because the dependence is absolute on the U.S. with this. You can't make a move with that plane without the U.S. Supporting it, technologically and in many ways. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much to our two speakers for this nice panel.